Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Hahn, and I'm facilitating the afternoon webinar series for Corwin. Welcome to Engagement by Design, How to Create a Learning Environment Where Students Thrive, with Doug Fisher, Nancy Frey, and Dominique Smith. Turn the presentation over to Rebecca Eaton, Executive Marketing Manager for Corwin.
Hi, this is Rebecca. I have the privilege of working with Doug and Nancy on a daily basis and have learned so much from them, and I'm really looking forward to learning more in this hour-long presentation. Doug and Nancy need no introduction. They have inspired thousands of teachers and students in their work as teacher leaders, consultants, professors, presenters, and authors. Between the two of them, they have led more than 1,000 in-services and written 40 professional books across K-12, affording them unmatched expertise. Doug and Nancy have authored several Corwin titles, including their brand new book, Engagement by Design, about which they will speak this evening, and bestsellers Visible Learning for Literacy, Visible Learning for Mathematics, Teaching Literacy in the Visible Learning Classroom K-5, Teaching literacy in the Visible Learning Classroom 612, Text Complexity, Text-Dependent Questions for K-5 and 612, and Rigorous Reading. Doug and Nancy are joined by colleague Dominique Smith. I've asked Doug, who works with Dominique every day, to tell you more about the work of this remarkable teacher, presenter, and now author. Doug?
I hope that's working. I was just told I was muted. Yes, Dominique is an administrator at the school where Nancy and I work. He also teaches social work classes and restorative practices and has written several books in the area of building school culture and climate, restoring relationships between teachers and students, and building equity in the classroom. We're very, very happy to work with him, as well as Russ Qualia and Lisa Landy, who wrote the books on teacher voice and student voice in the collaboration of this particular project. So we'll start here. Our opening sentence from Visible Learning for Literacy is this: every student deserves a great teacher, not by chance, but by design. So if you want to put something in the chat window, what word or phrase is jumping out to you when you think about that sentence? Is it every student? Is it the great teacher? Is it deserves? What are you thinking about when you think about that sentence? What jumps out to you? And I'll just watch chat for a minute. Thank you. Several of you are picking design. I'm seeing several people write every student, another design. Great teachers. Students don't learn by chance, so why would we teach them by chance? Every student. Well done. Thank you for taking apart. Design is the intentionality. So we're going to talk a little bit about design, and we're going to talk a few areas of design, the first of which is going to be from John Hattie. John Hattie wrote Visible Learning and Visible Learning for Teachers, and has collaborated with Nancy and I on translating this huge research base into literacy, mathematics, and very soon into science. John has this huge database with over 1,200 meta-analyses now, 300 million kids, and he really was able to show what works best, what really works best to improve students' learning. John, if you haven't seen this work before, built this barometer of effect, and he uses this to show how effective something is. What's the effect size? And he says some things we do as educators have a negative impact on students' learning. They cause harm. Other things we do are more developmental. No offense, but it was no better than letting the kids grow up for a year. Yet very low impact on students' learning. Some things are the average teacher effects, where we're getting a little bit more effect than developmental, but it's not really getting the impact that we want for students. And then some things are in that zone of desired effect, where you get a full year of learning for a year of schooling. And we want to keep things that we pay attention to in that 0.4 and above, because John showed that hinge point of 0.4 effect size is where you get, on average, a year of learning for a year of school. A year of input gives you a year of performance. That's where we want to keep thinking about, is how do we get that 0.4 and above? What things should we pay attention to? And his list is hundreds of strategies long. And people have a hard time thinking about, like, what strategy should I use and which is better? And some people take a top 10 approach, which is a really bad idea. How do we select which are high-yield strategies that will help us get better and improve students' learning? I'll give you a couple examples. Mobility, the highest negative impact on students' learning in the list, that when students change schools, they lose a lot of learning. And that people always say, well, we can't control the parents move the kids, but we can control how we respond when students change schools. So I'm going to give you the list of, I'm going to go through a few of these, not all 150 of them, but a sampling. Another negative is holding kids back in grade level. When they fail first grade or they fail kindergarten, there's not a real positive impact. And some people don't like this because they think giving a student an extra year of school should be helping them. The research just doesn't say that that's a positive thing. In fact, it causes harm. In fact, there are no studies that showed that it would have any impact positively on students' learning. Ability grouping and tracking does nothing more than 0.12 effect size, very minimal effect, low effect, and yet teachers have all kinds of conversations around tracking kids, ability grouping them, putting them in the low group, the high group, etc. Here's something that actually works. Getting students into a small group and actually teaching them something. Needs-based small group instruction works. It gives you more than a year of learning for a year of schooling. Teaching students how to study also works. I'm kind of passionate about this one now because I don't see a lot of study skills happening. I see a lot of places that study skills are kind of gone. And I think we need to reinvest in study skills and teach students how to study so they develop a habit of studying and then can select the tools they want to use to learn. Getting students to read again has a good impact on students' learning. I particularly like this one, given our work on close reading, that there's good evidence that getting students to go back and read something again improves their learning. Getting students to talk to each other in class, having discussions and collaborating with their peers has a powerful impact on their learning at this point. We're now doubling the speed of learning. They learn a lot when they're engaged in meaningful classroom discussions. And the new number one, the top effect on students' learning is collective teacher efficacy. When teachers get together, they believe passionately in what they're doing. They believe that what they do makes a difference, that what they do matters. They have systems in place to make sure that they're responding to students who do and don't learn. This is the number one impact on students' learning. So when we think about all these things, there are hundreds of them. What can we do and what do we not want to do? And it gets a little overwhelming. Like, where do I go? Where do I start? What do I not do? So I started thinking about this. And Richard Elmore had written this book around classroom observation, and he says there are three things you think about when you observe a classroom. The teacher, what is the teacher doing? What is the student or what are the students doing? And what is the content they're trying to learn? And so in Elmore's work, there's this idea of the teacher, the student, and the content. And so we started talking about what would happen when these circles start to overlap. What would be the learning? What would be the impact? What would be the ideas from these overlapping circles? So we start with the teacher, and I'll turn this over to Dominique.
And when we see the teacher, we move into the student, because those are two areas that we see within our organization. And the part that we have to combine is that teacher and students are together, and what we believe works is relationships. When a teacher and a student have a relationship, John Hattie's research shows us that they have a huge effect size for our students. When we look at this, this is one of the levels of moving forward for almost 2 years. What we can do right here, one simple idea, is making sure that we know our students, getting to know them, know their name, know their activities, know how to pronounce their name correctly, make home visits, and just be around our students, having conversations to get to know them, get to figure out who they are, and not just treat them like every other person. So for example, a fun way to get to know some people is by knowing names, and here's a quick little video to show you exactly what we're talking about.
1 minute, 1 minute please. Time, thank you. Could you all please put down your pens and bring your papers to the front of the room? Thank you. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, you're too late. Gave you plenty of warnings about time. You failed. Sorry.
Excuse me, do you know who I am?
I have absolutely no idea.
Good.
So with our video, the big focus is making sure that we have that connection between teacher and student. And not just your high-performing students and not just your students that are on the high flyer list, but every student that's in your classroom. And then taking that step outside and getting those students that are walking through your halls, getting to know who they are, getting to say hello every day to students that are in your building. Because relationships feed off the idea of culture. And building a strong culture within our school can make a huge difference on building strong, equitable relationships.
So when we think about the teacher and the overlap with the student, we call that a relationship. And Dominique talked about the power of student-teacher relationships. But there's another overlap that we can have.
In the same way that we think about the important players that are involved in any school, of course, the teacher is an important part, but so is the content, what it is that we actually teach our students. And when we look at the interaction between the teacher and the content, we define that as clarity. Clarity is an essential part of what it is that we're able to accomplish with our students. And in fact, the effect size of teacher clarity is at a 0.75 level, which is equivalent to almost 2 years worth of growth. It's a way of accelerating student learning. Now, what does teacher clarity mean? What are we talking about when we say that? 3 elements to consider around teacher clarity and what that means. One is that the teacher knows what it is that students need to learn, not simply being able to read the objective that is written at the top of a lesson plan, but to really be able to communicate what it is that those students are going to learn, which is the second element that you see there. The teacher understands what they're going to learn, and the teacher is able to communicate those learning intentions to students. The third element of that is that the teacher and the students have a shared understanding of the success criteria. It's difficult to be able to perform or to move forward in your own learning if you don't have a clear idea of what success looks like. Or as a learner, if you're not sure that your teacher knows what success looks like. It's a way of being able to not only reduce frustration on the parts of students and of teachers, but even more importantly, to really get them learning in much more precise kinds of ways. We often talk about the ability to communicate those learning intentions and the success criteria as establishing purpose. It's not enough for the teacher to know, you have to be able to communicate it. But when we talk about establishing purpose, it's really focused on what it is that the students are learning. That's that learning intention, not communicating to them the activity or the assignment or the task. Those are all important to have. That's what an agenda is for. But your learning intention, what is it that students are going to be learning, is an essential part of clarity. When we talk about those goals or those learning intentions, many of you probably recognize these terms that we often refer to them as SMART goals, that they're specific and measurable and attainable and relevant and timed. Those are important conditions of that. But what often gets overlooked is that fourth one, relevant. Why are we learning what it is that we're learning? If you come and visit our school, many of the classes in our school have this word posted in really large letters on the wall because we want students and the teacher to always be giving consideration to the relevancy, to why it is that we're learning this. Not just what we're learning, but why it is that we're learning this. In the next 2 videos that come up, we're going to show you some video that was made on the same day, in the same school, in same classrooms. The first video, which we're going to show you in just a moment, are students who were attempting to answer the question, why were they learning something? And as you'll see, they aren't able to do so.
Why do you think that's important when you write, to have all these senses in there? Why does that help? I don't know. I think.
I never really thought about it. Para aprender. We need to learn all of the physical properties of matter. Because we're going to have a science test. We're going to have a test. We need to memorize. I never really thought about it.
And who are you writing this to? Who's going to get that paper that you're writing?
It's a folder.
Do you actually share that writing with anybody, or you just put it in your folder?
We just leave it in here.
Oh, very good. Why is it important to learn the word colossal or any of these other words in Wordly Wise?
We expand our vocabulary.
So why is that important? So you have a big vocabulary. Who cares?
Because it will help us out later in life to get a job.
To get a job? Think so?
I never really thought about it. It also will help you in the future, like to get AP classes in high school and stuff.
Oh, very good.
¿Estás aprendiendo esto por qué?
Para CSTs, para prepararnos para que cuando ya llegue van a venir preguntas así y estemos listos. And cut.
Okay, so why did we learn that?
Because it's the California standards.
That's a good.
¿Y para qué creen que es importante saber la geometría?
Para, ¿cómo se dice? Para poder...
No. ¿Qué te imaginas tú para qué?
Why do we do summary writing? What's the point of that?
To practice it.
Yeah, definitely for practice. Why do you write about the 5 senses? Why is that important?
Remember we talked, there's no watermelons in the rainforest. How about ice?
Why do we learn that? Why is that important?
That made it easy.
And you guys want to help?
I never really thought about it.
Keep in mind that when we show you the second video, that these were all done on the same day, in the same school, in the same classrooms, but with different students.
Well, why do we learn similes? Why do you think?
To make your stories more entertaining.
Very good. So why do you think the teacher makes you do this? What's the point?
So we understand how to like draw conclusions and stuff like that.
Entonces, ¿por qué es importante saber esto?
Para que sabemos cuáles son abiertas y cuáles son cerradas.
Doing vocabulary like this.
To show our understanding of vocabulary words and or criteria.
And why do you think that's important to learn more vocabulary?
Well, it widens your vocabulary, and therefore widens your understanding of complex literature.
Not bad. Why do we do main idea and details? What's the point of that? Why do you do that?
We do it because so we could know what main ideas are and topics are.
Learning that because we need we're scientists and we're trying to learn what the properties of an apple is, and to figure out what you can describe it about.
Okay.
Because it describes the paragraph more, and it takes out all the things that don't really care.
Very well said. And last question. What do you?
Quiero preguntarles para qué es importante saber la sílaba tónica.
Porque no lo puedes decir como feria, porque luego el señor dice ¿qué?
Entonces El saber la sílaba.
Pegajosa, pegajosa, pegajosa.
¿Eso qué es? ¿Qué es lo que acabas de hacer?
Es para mirar cuántas sílabas tienen, como pegajosa, 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 y dicen cuántas sílabas tienen.
¿Por qué es importante saber las sílabas?
Porque necesitas saberlo para poder ser bien de escritoria.
Why is it important to have adjectives?
Because if you only say like, they will be like, they would be trees, it wouldn't be a really good story.
We believe really strongly that the voices of students are what really guide us in whether they understand what the learning intention is or not. We're not going to know unless we ask them these questions. Keep in mind that every learner, whether you're 5 years old or 45 years old, is constantly posing these three questions to himself or herself. What am I learning today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know that I have learned it? We owe that to our students to be able to address those questions. And just because we believe we have established purpose doesn't mean that every child in the class understood it. We have to go and check in with them. Those first two questions that are up there, what am I learning today and why am I learning this? Those speak to learning intentions and relevance. But let's look at that third one as well. How will I know that I've learned it? Not how will my teacher know, but how I will know that I've learned it. And that's that third element of teacher clarity, that teachers and students understand success criteria. We're going to show you one more video. It's a video that's just about a minute long, and you'll meet a little girl named Sarah who is talking toward the end of her kindergarten classroom year. She's talking about writing, using a writing rubric, and how she understands where it is that she is and where it is that she's headed.
Sarah, can you tell us how this chart works? We'll point to them and tell us about it.
I know nobody's on this, but some people might not be on this.
How come?
Because some people won't do that because we're in kindergarten, but some people might do that.
Good. Now go further up the chart and tell us about the middle of it, Sarah, around the orange crayon.
Well, some people sound it out and try and make their letters neat on this one.
Good. And what about further up the chart, Sarah? Then what happens?
On this one, they try to sound it out. They try to make their letters neatly and try to make the thing right. This is where I am. I sound it out. I try to keep them nicely written. I try to make the right words. I try to keep the letters with a space before they start. And I'm going over to here because it's the last step and I'm over at the 9 step. This is the 10 step.
Pretty extraordinary what Sarah was able to accomplish. She explained that writing rubric. She used reasoning to be able to argue her status. And she talked about a set of experiences that writers have at each of the levels that she profiled. You don't need to wait until you're in middle school or high school or college to be able to understand what success looks like. Even the youngest of children thrive on that kind of feedback and information. So one more time, the 3 questions that every learner wants to have answered. What am I learning today? Why am I learning this? And how will I know that I've learned it? That's learning intentions and success criteria. And sandwiched in between there is relevance. This is from the school where the 3 of us work. This is an example of helping students to understand and assess their own knowledge, to understand what success criteria look like. One of our colleagues uses this system with her exit slips. students answer the exit slips, but she takes it 1 degree further, and she has them place in those bins themselves using their own self-assessment. I'm just learning this, or I'm almost there, or I own this. I can work on it independently, or even better, I'm a pro, I can teach others. By simply adding that layer onto her exit slips, she gets students to really think closely about what the success criteria is and where it is that they place themselves. We'll talk about the third aspect of this. We've talked about student-teacher relationships, and we've talked about teacher clarity. Let's talk about the third element of this. Again, when we talk about schools, we think about the student and the interaction with the content itself. They aren't separate from one another. And when we've really got that interaction of content and student working well, we call that challenge. We want to be able to have a sufficient level of challenge for students. Again, there's a strong research base behind this. John refers to this as the Goldilocks challenge. Not too hard, not too boring. And this is where learning occurs. Learning doesn't happen simply by repetitively doing what it is that you already know. It happens in that stretch. We don't want to stretch students so far that a great deal of frustration sets in, but we do want them to feel that challenge.
So we'll talk a little bit about the kinds of tasks we designed for students. So remember, we're having these three ideas: the teacher, the student, and the content. Where the student and the teacher overlap, we call that relationships. Where the teacher and the content overlaps, we call that clarity. And the place where the student overlaps with the content, we call that challenge. But what's the appropriate level of challenge? Is it surface learning, deep learning, or the transfer of learning? Surface learning is individual skills and concepts, one skill, one concept that students need to learn to get their next level. A lot of people talk bad about surface learning. Surface learning is really important. It's prerequisite, it's introductory, it's foundational, it's really important. We don't want to skip surface learning. We've been in lots of conversations where people will say, let's get to the deep learning, let's get right to the deep learning. It's not possible to go deep learning unless you already have surface learning. Deep learning is about students seeing the connections, relationships, and building schema so they can organize those skills and concepts that they've developed at the surface level. Again, there's nothing wrong with surface learning as long as we don't leave students there. We want to get them into deep learning. One common instructional routine or strategy is concept maps. It's a good case in point here. We're going to argue that different literacy strategies have different utility at the surface learning versus the deep learning versus the transfer of learning. Concept maps are a great example. If you don't have concepts yet, it is very difficult to map them or to graphically organize them. Concept maps and graphic organizers work best at the deep level. They don't work very well at the surface level. What ends up happening is students copy what their teachers show on a dry erase board or on a document camera. So we don't want to seek graphic organizers when it's time for surface learning, but we have to change our strategy so when it comes to deep learning, we're doing something different to push students into that kind of learning. And then eventually we go to transfer, where students self-regulate to continue learning the skills and content, where they apply that knowledge to new situations. But there's a journey that kids go on from the surface to the deep to transfer, and that's how we maintain that challenge. It's not just what works, it's what works when. We're arguing that there are instructional routines in science and in mathematics and in English language arts and history, art, PE, music, that there are instructional routines that work really well for surface, and there are different routines that work well for deep learning and transfer learning. Surface learning, as I said earlier, is important. Surface learning is really important to get the foundation of learning to happen. And here are a few surface learning techniques. These work really well when students need surface level learning. For example, prior knowledge. Connecting to what you already know is really useful when you're learning something new, when something's novel, when it's brand new to you. When you already have a pretty good surface level of knowledge, you don't need those connections to prior knowledge anymore. Vocabulary. The teacher is teaching vocabulary, like word sorts or word cards or Frey model cards or whatever. you're only ever going to get students to the surface level. If the students start using the words in their collaborative conversations, they have a chance of going deep. So here are a couple instructional routines that help teachers get students to the surface learning. And what I thought I would do is pick on reading volume for a minute. Just as an example, it's reading widely under the topic here. So getting students reading volume up. Student A reads on average 20 minutes a day. That student reads on about 1.8 million words a year. And that student scores in the 90th percentile. That's where we want kids. We want them reading a minimum of 20 minutes a day outside of the school day so they get that volume to go. Student B reads on average 5 minutes a day. That volume drops to 282,000 words, and that student scores in the 50th percentile. And student C reads on average 1 minute per day. That volume drops to 8,000 words per year, and that student scores in the bottom 10th percentile. There's some really interesting vocabulary research that's coming out. I'm going to go back a couple. Student A, overall, from all forms of instruction, reading, direct instruction, collaborative conversations, etc., student A learns about 2,700 new words over the course of the year, partly because those words stick. Nancy and I have a personal trainer. She has a first grader, and she recently said to her son, our personal trainer said to her first grade son, Derek, would you like a Frisbee? They were going to the park. And he said, that would be handy. And she was surprised. And she said to him, where did you learn the word handy? Because that's not a word that her family uses. And he says, well, it's what Captain Underpants says all the time. Captain Underpants said it would be handy to have fake doggy do in the recent chapter of a picture book, of a chapter book he was reading. Some of the words kids learn, they learn from their reading. Some from instruction, some from interacting with other people. So we want students learning a lot of words. And if you know the vocabulary research, on the first day of kindergarten, there's a 3,000 word gap between kids who live in poverty and kids who live in middle class homes. And the gap gets wider and wider without really good intervention. So this student B, reads about 5 minutes per day on average. That student learns about 800 new words in the course of a year. Student C learns 0 new words over the course of a year from any form of instruction. So we want to close the vocabulary gap. We've got to get students reading more. We've got to increase the volume of what they are going to be reading. There's a couple of things that have been shown to improve the volume of reading. I'll go through them pretty quickly. You can certainly email us if you want us to follow up. Number one, students have to have access to lots of things to read. If they're going to have, if you're at home and you want to read and there's nothing to read, you're probably going to reduce your volume. Number two, choice. If I tell you you must read Catcher in the Rye or Diary of Anne Frank or Shiloh or Charlotte's Web, if I tell you, it's probably going to reduce your volume. If we increase choice, we increase volume. Number three, students want to talk about what they are reading. They don't necessarily want to write book reports, but they do want time to talk about the text that they are reading. And number four, the adults in their lives, their teachers, bless books. They do book talks, about 3 to 5 books every single day, where they talk about interesting and cool books that students might want to read. So we actually know something about raising volume and building surface level learning. It's just not commonly done. But I'm not going to talk a lot about surface learning because it's important, but it's not enough. We have to get students into deep learning.
And deep learning is an essential part in the place where we want to be able to move our students to. Superficial learning, as Doug has explained, is a way that we build that foundational knowledge. But the deep learning phase is when we help students begin to be able to synthesize that knowledge, to begin to apply that knowledge. And on the screen, you'll see there's a list of some of those approaches that work really well at this space. Things like concept mapping and doing graphic organizers. Importantly, not copying what it is that the teacher has written on the concept map, but rather having students develop those concept maps themselves, because what it reflects is their growing schema and how it is that they organize that information. Doug talked earlier about classroom discussion. Look at the effect size on that. It really helps to accelerate learning when you get a chance to talk about what it is that you're learning about and listen to the ideas of others. Questioning is another part of this, both self-questioning as well as the robust questioning that teachers can use. Not simply checking for superficial levels of understanding, but asking those really robust questions that cause students to think. Here's a place where we want metacognitive strategies to begin happening as well. When you think about your own thinking, those are those metacognitive strategies that help students to be able to take on their own learning. And then reciprocal teaching is another one that we have listed there. Reciprocal teaching has a strong research base, and there's lots of information out there about how it is that students engage in reciprocal teaching. One of the things that we know that is really useful is to get students into text for long periods of time and to have those important discussions with the teacher asking those robust kinds of questions that get dialogue really happening. We refer to that often as close reading. Close reading is a great approach for that. It's important to be able to say that with close reading, we want students to engage in those complex kinds of texts. Here's one example of some complex text for those of you that teach at the high school level. These are the orders of the day that General Eisenhower wrote on D-Day to the troops. At the same time, and here's what that message looks like, just simply transposed in another way. Some nice complex text that's there, not only being able to figure out what it was that he was referring to, but why. How was he motivating the troops on this momentous day? And so that's where the teacher comes into play. We want this kind of text in front of them, but then we want to ask those robust questions that get them to look back into the text again. And I'll move through these rather quickly, but keep in mind that all of these will be archived and you'll have all of these questions in the text as well. But examples of robust questions. We can begin to ask them questions after they've read it through a couple of times. What are some of the words and phrases that General Eisenhower used to inspire the troops on D-Day? We want to ask them questions about how it was that he acknowledged the difficulty of the mission. How did they assure them that they were going to be triumphant? Another type of question to ask is to draw their attention back into specific quotes, as you'll see in the middle of the screen there, and asking them, what does that sentence really say about the person who wrote this? We could talk about the use of religious imagery that happens at the beginning and at the end. And keep in mind that the place where we started those questions was at that surface level. What are some of the words and phrases? But we keep going deeper and deeper with students by hanging out with that text. Here's another example of asking them now much deeper questions after we've hung out with that text, we've read it, and we've discussed it. Based on the text, what is General Eisenhower's state of mind before the D-Day invasion? What do you think was going on in his head at that time? That's when we'll introduce a second piece of text. This is referred to as the in case of failure letter. It was a memo that Eisenhower wrote on the same day, the day before D-Day, and he drafted a memo just in case the invasion was actually a failure. Fortunately, he never had to use this memo, but it raises their awareness at a more heightened level about what the conflicting emotions must have been for this leader on the day before this momentous event. So now we can ask them, based on this second text, what do you think his state of mind was before that invasion? We want them to go deeper. Quite frankly, we don't want them to always be able to find easy answers. Now we can ask to compare the audiences for these two texts. Who was each of those audiences for those texts, and why were they written in very different manner? And finally, we might even ask them to take a look at that single word bravery, which is capitalized. what does that say about Eisenhower, and what does that say about the message that he wanted to convey, that he incorrectly capitalized it?
So close reading is a really good approach for deepening students' learning. It's impossible to do close reading at the surface level of something. They don't know enough to engage in deep learning. And one of the points we'd like to make is that without changing to a more complex tasks, students will not deepen their learning. We have to change the instruction and the tasks we ask students to do. And we've been talking about as a profession rigor. Rigor is for everyone. We talk about rigor all the time. We got to get students into rigorous, complex tasks to deepen their understanding. And we've heard rigor used a lot in the world of education. But whenever we ask someone to write down their definition of rigor, it gets very confusing. Most people don't have a good definition that works for them to define what rigor means. So we've been working on this for a while, and we'd like to propose that rigor is a careful or complex balance between difficulty and complexity. Difficulty is how much effort, how much time, how much work a student has to put forth, and complexity is the kind of thinking, the number of steps in a process, how much background knowledge you need. So yes, there is some overlap, but as teachers work on rigor, we have to think about difficulty and complexity. If rigor is only difficult, students are going to hate school and they're going to hate their teachers. They don't want just more difficult things to do. They want complex things. And that's what John Hattie's research showed, is that students appreciate the complexity of the tasks we assign them. So we drew these quadrants, and we said there are some tasks that are low difficulty, low complexity. And a lot of people thought that meant, can you repeat the definition of rigor? Rigor, yes, I can repeat the definition of rigor. Rigor is a complex balance between difficulty, how much time, how much effort, how much work we ask of students, and how much thinking, how much action, steps, or how much background knowledge. Let me go through this and we'll see if that helps. There are some tasks that are low difficulty, low complexity. And some people say, oh, those are not important tasks. And some of you are taking notes right now. You're taking paper, pencil notes, computer notes, digital notes, whatever. I would argue that note-taking for most of you is a low difficulty, low complexity task. It is not an unimportant task. We call those tasks fluency tasks. In the research world, they're called automaticity. In the popular press, they're called habits, how you develop students' habits. That's where we want everything to go. All the teaching we do, we want to develop students' fluent behavior with it, where they do it with great ease and great automaticity. That's our goal there. Then some of the tasks we give them fall in the stamina quadrant. Perseverance. Angela Duckworth wrote a book on grit. That's what we're trying to accomplish there. We raise the difficulty, but it's not very complex. You have to stick with it. You have to persevere. You have to keep working through stuff. If students practice enough, tasks will move out of their stamina quadrant into their fluent quadrant. A one-time research project is not going to become a fluent behavior for students. But if they engage in research papers on a regular basis, slowly and surely it becomes part of their fluent behavior. On the top, low difficulty, high complexity tasks require strategic thinking. We have to slow down, be consciously aware. We have to make a decision. For example, I'm going to inference here, or I'm going to question here. It's time for a summary. We want students to slow down and be very intentional with that. At some point in your life, you did not automatically make inferences. Someone tried to teach you to inference. And when you first started inferencing, it was very awkward. It was very laborious. You were consciously aware of it. And over time, it became a habit for you. You do it with fluency. And yet, when the text gets more complex for you, you come out of fluent behavior and you go back into strategic thinking. To move something out of strategic thinking, students need teacher modeling and they need feedback. To move it out of stamina, they need practice. The last quadrant is the struggle quadrant, where students are engaged in very difficult, very complex tasks, like a close reading lesson. And teachers observe students struggle, and they identify what caused the struggle, because that becomes the future teaching points. What is causing my students this struggle? Because then I need to figure that out and teach them. You cannot move from struggle to fluency. You have to move from struggle to strategic thinking or struggle to stamina. Stamina requires practice. Strategic thinking requires teacher modeling and feedback. That's how this is moving to increase the level of rigor that we have provided to our students.
That final phase of learning that we wanted to talk about is around transfer. Transfer is arguably the long-term goal of any learning that goes on. We love this quote by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, that it is that long-term goal, and that when you truly understand and excel at something, you're able to take what you've learned in one way or context and use it in another on your own. It's that application of skills and concepts and knowledge to increasingly new and novel situations that really signals to us when transfer should occur. But like all of the other strategies that we've talked about, we need to pair the right strategies with the right phase of learning. Reading across documents, which we demonstrated for you earlier, is something that is much more useful whenever students have a deep background knowledge to all of that. We wouldn't necessarily use those two Eisenhower documents outside the context of a U.S. history unit of instruction on World War II. Students need to have all of that background knowledge in order to be able to understand those documents. But boy, when we can get them reading across documents, especially when they conflict with one another, that's a wonderful opportunity for students to really begin to transfer knowledge. Formal discussions, debates, Socratic seminars, those kinds of things. This is more than just the informal discussions that we host in our classroom, but those formal ones where you really have to come prepared for that debate or that discussion. That's a place where transfer happens. John uses the term problem-solving teaching. That's what it's commonly called in other parts of the world. We would refer to it as problem-based learning. And it's got a high effect size, as you can see, but here's a really important point. Problem-based learning is effective at the transfer level. It's awfully ineffective at the surface level. And why is that? It's because at the surface level of learning, at the beginning of a unit, students simply don't have enough knowledge to really be able to act on that. So we want to put problem-solving teaching or problem-based learning into play. You want to do it whenever students have already built up that surface level of knowledge and they've gone deeper, or they're organizing it conceptually. Extended writing is another example of that. Peer tutoring. We've all been in times and places where we have seen that when you know how to teach something to someone else, that's a signal that you know it deeply yourself.
So we've been thinking about these three circles: the teacher, the student, and the content students are trying to learn. And we think of these now as kind of the low-hanging fruit and how to get students to engage. One area is around relationships. Students are not going to engage in rigorous, complex tasks unless they trust the adults that are around them. They are also not going to engage in struggle in those complex tasks if they don't know what it is they're supposed to be learning. That's why we care so much about this work on engagement, is that to get students to engage is an outcome, a byproduct of what we do. It's not the prerequisite. We think we've been wrong. The profession's been wrong about this. People think you have to first have students engage and then they learn something. We think engagement's on the other side. When they trust the adults around them, when they know what they're supposed to be learning, when they're given complex tasks to engage in, or that they care about, that's when they engage. And when we think about this, it's really about the right approach at the right time for the right kind of learning. Do I know what my students need? What is it that I want to work on next with them? What's the level of thinking they're ready for? When we think about the student, the teacher, and the content, they overlap in relationships, clarity, and challenge. And when that occurs, we have deep learning that's meaningful for our students, and they engage because of those circles coming together. Thank you so much for your time. We have a few minutes left for questions. If there are any, we can put them in the chat, and we are happy to answer. One question is about accessing the PowerPoint, so I'm going to turn that to our sponsors and let them know about how to get the PowerPoint.
Hi, this is Rebecca. So you will be able to we will be emailing you with a link to the PowerPoints and a link to the webinar. So look out for that email probably on Thursday. If you don't hear from us by Thursday, you can contact me, Rebecca Eaton, and just the way it sounds, Rebecca.Eaton at Corwin.com, and I'll take care of it. Thanks.
And I just put that in the chat, so if you can't get it, Rebecca's email is in the chat now.
There are some other questions. Do you want me to read the questions for you, and do you want to answer them?
Sure.
What role can teacher librarians play in the designing of learning and reading?
Oh, they play a critical role. They help teachers in text selection. They help teachers analyze text for what makes the text complex. They help design rigorous tasks around the texts that have been selected for students. Librarians are also a great resource for relationships. Every single adult in the school needs to have a group of kids that are the go-to, that's the adult I go to in my school to connect with. And in addition to those relationships, librarians can help with clarity. Why are we learning all of this? What is it that we're trying to accomplish?
Nice. I have another question for you. Is there a link or a book that would provide deep learning questions that we could use to ask students?
Yes, the book Nancy and I wrote is called Text-Dependent Questions. It's all about how to construct those questions that get students to dive deeper and deeper into the text.
Terrific. And one last question. How would you modify the approach that you outlined today for high school students?
I think that was in relation to the Sarah video, because we work at a high school, so we think all of this relates directly to high school. But I think that question comes directly from the Sarah video with her talking about her success in writing. And I think it takes for high schoolers to know, here's what I'm learning today, here's what success looks like, where am I right now in my learning, where am I going? So that they can start to articulate, here's what I've already learned, and here's what I still need to learn.
Terrific. Thank you. I could turn it over to Rebecca now. Rebecca, do you want to wrap things up?
Sure. Well, first I want to thank Doug and Nancy and Dominique for taking time out of what I know is a very busy day to talk with all of us. I hope everybody enjoyed that and learned as much as I did. Want to let you know that the book about which Doug and Nancy and Dominique have been speaking is Engagement by Design. It is available through Corwin at www.corwin.com/literacy. The price of the book is $34.95, but if you purchase it directly from Corwin, you can get a 20% discount, and that's a $7 savings. So I think we all like to save. And if we could just advance the slide one more slide. I just wanted to let you know that Doug and Nancy and Dominique are all available for consulting through Corwin. You just need to contact us on the website, and there will be information there about how you can call us and how you can set up time to talk with one of our representatives about bringing Doug, Nancy, or Dominique, or another member of the Fisher-Frey Collaborative into your school or district. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.